Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christopher Taub, the Chief Deputy Attorney General, and I've got Christina Moylan with me also. She is the Chief of our Consumer Protection Division. And I just want to welcome everyone to this first meeting of the Right to Repair Working Group. We recognize that a lot of you folks are incredibly busy, and so we really appreciate you taking some time out to participate in this group. I also want to introduce you to Katrina Bono. She's on the far end. She's a paralegal in our office, and she'll be helping us with all sort of the logistics and technical details and like all the really important stuff that is going on behind the scenes. What I thought we'd do is maybe just start with introductions around the table here. And I do want to say that there are a couple of people who at the last minute weren't able to make it. So they have sent proxies in their place. And so maybe for people who are proxies, maybe if they can, in addition to introducing themselves, maybe they could also just explain who they're filling in for today. So maybe if we start at the far end with Joe, and we'll just go down the table.
My name is Joe Quirk.
Yep, there you go. Sorry about that.
All right. My name is Joe Quirk. I'm representing my father, John Jack Quirk, who couldn't be here today. He was asked by the Maine auto dealers to represent the dealers of Maine on this board. My family's been in business since 1973, starting in Bangor, Maine, with one franchise, and we've grown to 12 franchises and 4 CarQuest stores, and now in Bangor, Augusta, Belfast, Rockland, Portland, and employ more than 500 people.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Gallagher. I'm here on behalf of the Independent Repair Facilities. I'm here in substitute for Tom Hickey from the Maine Automotive Right to Repair Coalition. I am a shareholder and consultant at Drummond Woodsum in Portland, and I was part of the leadership for the Automotive Right to Repair ballot initiative.
Hello, my name is Brian Boggs. I work for Tesla. We manufacture electric vehicles, and I'm the Senior Director of Service Engineering, making repair and maintenance information and scan tools available to independent repairs and authorized dealerships.
Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Frazier. I am an attorney partner at Pierce Atwood, and I represent the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And I sit on the seat representing the motor vehicle manufacturers. Happy to be here today.
Hi, I'm Lynn Gardner, and I am the designee for the Secretary of State. I am the current Director of Legal Affairs for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles.
So I think, as I've mentioned in our communications with folks, this first meeting, we recognized that it was a little hard to schedule, being summertime, and so it was difficult to get everyone here in person. Although our first meeting does have to be in person pursuant to our Freedom of Access Act laws. But in recognition of the fact that not everyone can be part of this, our thought was that this first meeting is going to be sort of mostly focused on kind of logistics and housekeeping and figuring out how we want to sort of structure our meetings in the future. Our meeting is being recorded, and what we'll do is we'll post the video to our YouTube page that we've set up, and so that way people who weren't here today are able to watch the meeting to sort of get caught up to speed. We also, just to mention this, I think people might be aware of it already, but within the Maine Attorney General's website, we've set up a Right to Repair working group page. And so it has a little bit of background about the working group. It has links to like the statutes and to the resolves. And we will post there the notifications of meetings. We'll post the agenda. If there's any materials that are going to be used for the upcoming meeting, we'll post all those materials there. We also have all of your email addresses. So whenever there's a communication that needs to go out, in addition to putting it on the website, we'll push out an email to everyone. And also we have sort of I think it's called like an interested parties link, or I think it says maybe invite or sign up or something. It's pretty obvious. What's that? Subscribe. So there's a subscribe button on the page. And if there are people that you're aware of who want to be following the work of the working group, if they just hit the subscribe button, then they'll also get all the notifications that are going out by email. So that's some of the logistics. As we're going to talk about a little bit later, our thought is, and this is something that we can discuss a little bit later in the meeting, but our thought is that since folks are coming from different parts of the country and it's not always going to be convenient to meet in person, our thought going forward is that all of our meetings going forward, if the group approves of it, will be 100% remote. And Megan, I think you might be down there. Yeah. You didn't miss anything. And once you get settled, I'll just ask you to introduce yourself, but take your time. So what our thought is, and again, this is open to discussion, but our thought is that going forward after today, our meetings will be 100% remote. So we'll have Zoom links that will go out to everyone. They'll go out to members of the public, so the public can observe on Zoom. And also to the extent that we're either, taking public comments at some point in this process, or if we want to hear from specific people, they can do that all by Zoom. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I just kind of wanted to flag that up front. All our meetings are going to be open to the public. That's pursuant to our Freedom of Access Act. So we'll make sure the public gets notice. It doesn't mean that we have to let the public comment at our meetings. We may want to have one or more meetings where we open it up to public comment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do that at every meeting. So that's something that we can be thinking about. So and then for this first meeting, and again, I don't mean to control the process, and if people have other ideas about how to proceed, please just jump in. But what I thought for this first meeting is that I could just provide sort of a little background, sort of some of the statutory background, and an overview of kind of what this group's mission is. And then I thought maybe we could have a discussion about, how many meetings we want to have and when we want to schedule the meetings for. Then we can talk about our remote meeting policy. That's something that's going to be, we have to have a public hearing on a remote meeting policy. I don't know if there's people out there who may want to comment on our public meeting policy that we proposed, but we'll give an opportunity for folks to do that. And then I think at that point, that should be the work for today. So let me just pause there and see if members of the group have any questions or things that they want to add to the agenda, or just anything at all that you want to throw into the mix at this point. All right. And Megan, do you want to just introduce yourself?
I apologize so much for being late. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Sway, and I'm the policy director at the ACLU of Maine.
Great. Okay, so it sounds like folks are comfortable with me kind of proceeding as planned. But again, if you want to jump in at some point, if there's something else that you want to discuss, just let me know. But what I thought would be helpful is just to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page here, so we have a sort of understanding of what the statutory overlay is. I'm sure for most of the members in the group, you're already pretty familiar with this, but just sort of out of an abundance of caution, I thought it'd be helpful to go back over it. For the most part, sort of this began with a citizen-initiated bill, which started as, I think, LD 1677, and that was the right to repair law. It was approved by a majority of Maine voters, and it took effect on January 5th of this year. And the law does a couple different things. It requires it essentially, and again, if people want to correct me, please feel free. But sort of as I just very generally think of the law, it does a couple things. It requires manufacturers to provide access to onboard diagnostic and repair information for vehicles, and it sort of breaks the vehicles out by year with slightly different requirements for different model years. So for 2002 to 2017, you have to give the same access to the owner or a repair facility as you would provide to a new vehicle dealer. For 2018 and up, there's sort of different protocols that have to be implemented in terms of how to access the onboard diagnostic information. And then as of January 5th of this next coming year, so January 5th of 2025, vehicles that are sold in Maine that use a telematics system are going to have some sort of standardized ability for folks to access the telematics data. So that's just sort of my very general description of the statute. Certainly, if people take issue with that characterization, please let me know. And I know that I'm not getting. I know there's details that I'm not addressing, but that's just sort of my very general overview of it. And then one of the other things that law did was it charged the Attorney General with designating something that was referred to as an independent entity, which was supposed to administer access to the vehicle-generated data. There were some other sort of responsibilities, including enforcing compliance and developing different types of standards and policies and protocols. So that law is in effect today. But sort of the wrinkle is that in this past session, the legislature considered eliminating the independent entity part of the statute. And so there was a bill that was proposed that was going to get rid of the independent entity. But then there was another bill that was proposed that was going to sort of charge the AG with doing a study group to figure out how to develop an independent entity. And my assumption is that the folks behind those measures were thinking that, we're going to have one bill that gets rid of the independent entity, but then we're also going to have another bill to talk about how to develop that. But as it turned out, the law eliminating the independent entity, the law that would have eliminated the provision that created the independent entity, that failed, but the one creating the study group passed. So we were left in a situation where we have sort of one law calling upon us to designate the independent entity and another law calling upon us to have a study group on how to create an independent entity. So in the AG's view, sort of the most practical, reasonable course is to do the study group first, since it seems to make sense to have a more fulsome discussion with all the stakeholders about how to put together this independent entity before we actually move forward with it. So that's our plan. That's why we've assembled the working group. So let me pause there again, see if folks have any comments or have any questions, or there's anything that folks want to throw out at this point. And please don't feel obligated. I just want to make sure that I'm not hijacking this process too much. Okay. So one of the things that Christina and I have been thinking about, and we just wanted to kind of flag this, is that we don't view this group's job as sort of, and I'm not quite sure how to articulate this, but we don't view this group's job as actually developing standards for access to vehicle data, or for deciding what kind of privacy policies there should be, or what kind of security measures should be in place, or sort of any of those technical details. Instead, what we understand our role to be is to figure out how to create this entity that is going to do all those things. So, I think we probably will need to sort of wade in at some point with some of these technical questions and issues. And I know that Christina and I have a bunch of questions. But I just kind of wanted to sort of make the point that some of the things that I think probably folks are interested in are probably things that the independent entity is going to have to be addressing, not things that necessarily our group is going to have to address at this point. Some of the things that we've just sort of been brainstorming on and thinking about in terms of what kinds of issues we think we're going to have to address are things like, for this independent entity, who is going to be the independent entity? I think under the citizen-initiated bill, it really seems like the idea was the independent entity would be sort of people from different sectors of businesses that have an interest in this issue of right to repair, and they would sort of serve as some kind of like board or some kind of oversight of this entity. And so certainly that's a model that we should be thinking about. And then we'd be thinking about, who are the different sort of categories of people who would be on the board. On the other hand, that kind of entity is something that's a little bit unusual in state government. What's more typical in state government for something like this is to have sort of like a regulatory entity. So you have a state agency that's staffed with state employees that has rulemaking authority and has enforcement authority and is charged with implementing a particular law. So I don't think we're necessarily tied to either of those, but I think it's something that at some point we should be thinking about, because it might make sense that one makes more sense than the other one, and I just think that everything is open for discussion. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about. Just other kind of practical things, we need to be thinking about where this entity would be housed. It doesn't really neatly fit into any particular agency, I don't think. But certainly there's a lot of different options out there. I think funding is going to be something that we're going to have to think about. It's not clear in my mind, and one of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute is sort of figuring out like what the vision is for this independent entity. But it seems like some of the work the independent entity is going to do is going to cost money. If they are developing some kind of software platform or they're working with technical experts, that's going to cost money. If they need staff, that's going to cost money. Even if it's just, people from different sectors of businesses, those people might be expecting compensation for the work they do. Certainly, if we decide to do this as sort of a state agency, it's going to require funding. So I think that those are just the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. And then sort of kind of the flip side of the corollary of that is if this entity does need funding, we have to figure out where the funding is going to come from. I think there's all kinds of options. I mean, obviously there could just be a direct appropriation from the legislature. There could be some kind of fee or surcharge or levy that's imposed on different entities that have some kind of interest in the process. I'm sure there's lots of other options out there. But we're just going to be thinking about if we do need to have funding for this thing, where is the funding going to come from? And then kind of the last thing we've just been thinking about is sort of the enforcement authority of the entity. It does seem like the citizen-initiated bill contemplates that this independent entity will be monitoring manufacturers' compliance with the law and will have some ability somehow to bring some sort of action against entities that, in their view, aren't complying with the requirements relating to access to diagnostic information. So I think that's also something we have to think about is sort of how the independent entity would enforce the requirements. And I'm sure there's a lot of other issues, but those are just the ones that Christina and I sort of immediately thought of as we were sort of prepping for this. In terms of timing, we have to submit a report to the legislature by February 28th of 2025. It has to contain the findings and recommendations of the group. And there's sort of some bullet points of things that those findings and recommendations have to address. Our hope is that we can produce a report where all of the findings and recommendations are consensus and unanimous. It's possible, though, that we won't be able to do that. In fact, given the diversity of interest in the working group, I can foresee that there are going to be some areas where maybe people have different recommendations, and think there are different things that should be proposed to the legislature. In our view, everyone's view should be represented to the legislature. So just because something is a minority view, we don't think that doesn't mean it does not go into the report. We think it still goes into the report. It just gets identified as, the view of the following entities. So, we might have, a majority of the working group, thought the following approach should be adopted. However, the following three entities believe that this other approach should be followed. So this is kind of a long way of saying that we don't view this a process where like the majority vote means that that's the only thing that goes in the report. Our intent is to represent to the legislature sort of the full panoply of views. Hopefully we can get consensus on a lot of stuff, but if we can't get consensus, then we'll make that clear in our report. So that's a lot of talking. I'm used to talking to judges where I get asked a lot of questions. And so this is unusual for me to talk for that long without interruption. Let me stop and just ask if any members of the group have any questions or want to add anything or just any input at all to all the stuff I just said. All right, this is a great group. All right, so I think it's entirely, up to the group to decide how we want to go forward in terms of our meetings. This is a really unusual, just to be honest, like Christina and I have never chaired something like this. And I think it's an unusual thing even in state government. This is kind of unusual to have this like working group that's going to study creation of this entity that's not really clearly defined. We don't really fully understand exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And it's also in an extremely technical area where, Christina and I, at least, we've spent a lot of time with some of the folks that are at the table now. And so we have sort of a very basic understanding of things like telematics information and the OBD2 ports and the kinds of on-vehicle diagnostic information that cars have and different ways to access it. But we're not feeling that we're at a level yet where we really have enough comfort to really be able to fully engage in this process. And as I sort of alluded to before, it's also, looking at the citizen initiated bill, there's questions we have about what this sort of what the vision is for this independent entity, because the law requires manufacturers to do certain things. And so it's not really clear to us completely sort of what the independent entity is supposed to do in addition to what the manufacturers are going to be required to do. I mean, certainly I think there's some idea that the entity will be doing monitoring and enforcement and will help develop standards, but we still have a lot of questions about sort of what this independent entity is actually going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. Is it creating a software platform? We don't think the independent entity is actually going to be housing any data. We think the idea is that the entity is supposed to be providing ways that people can access the data from wherever it's being stored already, but that's something we're not sure about either. So these are the sort of the two things that we thought might be helpful for our next meeting. And so I just want to throw these out and then open it up to discussion. We thought that that one thing that'd be really helpful is to get just a better sense of what the intent was behind the independent entity. And so this was a citizen initiated bill, so we don't have any sort of legislative history on it per se. But there are people who are in this group who were involved in the process to sort of develop and support the legislation. And so, I'm thinking of like the Maine Right to Repair group, and there might be some other folks. So what we thought would be helpful, and this is just from our perspective, if other folks don't think it's helpful, then we can certainly discuss that. But at least what Christina and I thought would be helpful would be to hear from representatives of the Maine Right to Repair Coalition, just sort of describe to us, and then we can ask them questions and we can have sort of a dialogue about, what did you intend this independent entity to do? How did you see it operating? What powers do you think it should have? Just kind of like those questions that aren't really fleshed out in the legislation. And so our thought is that the Maine Right to Repair folks, could sort of give that presentation. We can ask questions and just kind of get a better sense of at least what the intent was behind. Now, that doesn't mean that the intent necessarily is what we are going to, that their view of the intent necessarily is going to control what we do, because other folks might have other ideas about what the intent was. But I think at least as a starting point, it would be helpful to hear from them. And if there are other folks who want to give their views of the intent, that's great too. But at least a starting point, we thought to hear from the Right to Repair Coalition. So that's kind of the first thing we thought would be helpful from our standpoint anyway. And then the other thing, and this is also sort of what I alluded to before, is at least for Christina and I, like we think it'd be just super helpful to get almost like a primer on telematics and vehicle diagnostic information, and just like, all the basics. Like, for example, what information do cars maintain on them? How do people get access to the information? How do authorized dealers get access to the information? How do owners and independent repair shops get access to it? Technical things like for telematics, I think there's a wireless component to that. What we're not really clear about is is this like a wireless connection between a particular car and the person who's getting the information? Or is it someone like sitting in their repair shop, like pulling information sort of off the cloud about a car? Like we just are ignorant about those sort of technical issues. And so for us, at least, we thought it'd be really helpful just to get kind of background information. And again, like an interactive process where maybe some folks can come in, describe to us what telematics is, what all this stuff is. All of us can ask them questions and just sort of get a better understanding. And so, for that part of it, I think, there's a lot of people here that probably have thoughts on that and could provide information about that. So, our thought is maybe for the second meeting, in addition to the Maine Right to Repair Coalition making a presentation, maybe if there are folks that are members already who want to come in and discuss telematics and diagnostic information and vehicle generated data, we think that'd be super helpful. And then not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but then, you know, we suspect that after that second meeting, you know, we think there's a pretty good chance that we're still going to have sort of factual questions or kind of like technical questions that maybe, you know, we haven't been able to get clear answers to or just don't have a good handle on. And so one of the other things that Tina and I were sort of thinking about is whether at the third meeting, if there are people that folks that are part of this group think it would be helpful for us to hear from, maybe we invite them to the third meeting to make presentations. So, you know, I know that there's consultants out there and technical folks and, you know, people that really have like really good knowledge of this stuff that the people on this group might not have the same sort of depth of knowledge about. And so, you know, if they're members who want to invite someone to come in, then we're thinking that would sort of be part of the process for the third meeting. And then that's kind of as far as we've gotten in terms of planning out or thinking out how these meetings are going to proceed. We did have, you know, in terms of timing, Christina and I really do feel that this is going to be a time crunch because we think these are complicated, difficult issues that we're going to be discussing. And we think it's going to take some time and we don't have a lot of time. So, and I know this is an aggressive schedule, but we're really thinking that having meetings like every 2 to 3 weeks is probably something we should be doing. If we can do those meetings remotely, if we can adopt the remote meeting policy, it's going to take some amount of pain out of that. But we just think to keep the momentum going, we really think, frankly, every 2 weeks we should be meeting. And if it turns out that we get a lot of progress, then maybe we can start scaling back a little bit. But at least up front, we were thinking every 2 weeks. And then just, I think this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop for a minute. We also, you know, and maybe this is a corollary to the idea of asking technical experts to come in, but also if folks think that the public should have some opportunity to participate, we may want to have a meeting or part of a meeting where we invite, you know, members of the public to come in, because I suspect there are, in fact, you know, there's people here in the audience today, but there may be other folks who would want to come in and describe experiences they've had with some of these issues, or, you know, what they hope this independent entity would look like. So again, I think that's something that we should talk about. So that's kind of as far as we've gotten. Let me ask this first in terms of, well, let me take this part first. In terms of timing, are people comfortable with the idea of having a meeting every 2 weeks, at least for the short term? Okay, I'm seeing everyone nodding up and down, so that's great. Okay, excellent. And then in terms of sort of what I described as well, let me stop there. I sort of described what I thought would be helpful for the next 2 meetings, but let me ask if people have different thoughts. If there's either stuff that you think, you know, that we don't need yet, or if there's additional stuff that we think we should be talking about in those first 2 meetings. Let me just get anyone's thoughts about you know, what my description was of sort of those next 2 meetings. Are people okay with that plan? Does it seem like that's the good step for the next 2 meetings? Is that okay? All right. Okay.
Can you get feedback
Yeah.
over there?
Oh, feedback? Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, we think you're right on point, or I do. And we'd be more than delighted to get that presentation together and provide that for the first meeting from the Automotive Right to Repair Coalition on the intent of the initiated legislation. We can also provide experts on telematics as well. Not that we'd be the sole folks, but we'd certainly, you know, provide folks that we think are excellent in this area for the next.
And then sort of turning to the representatives of the automotive manufacturers, I think it would be helpful to get your perspective on telematics and diagnostic information. So I'm wondering if, you know, if it's not either of you necessarily, if a representative could be at the next meeting to sort of talk in addition to the folks from the Right to Repair Coalition.
Do you want to start, Brian?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I actually liked the layout that you proposed, in part because I see it as sort of, you know, a continuing expansion of the conversation, right? Sort of getting you introduced, getting you grounded, and then expanding from there. So certainly for the next meeting, I know Brian could speak to it at great length, and I could come prepared as well with that, as you said, sort of primer. I think a future third meeting where more technical experts come in. Obviously, Brian is the technical expert, so he's kind of already here, but to have then others as well might make sense to then go further, because I do think there's going to be a bit of a learning curve for all of us. So I like that approach
Okay.
and would certainly be happy to speak next meeting.
Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Brian, go ahead.
Yes, so I'm happy to speak about telematics in one of those future meetings. And I think you highlighted how there's a lot of uncertainty about the role or the nature or the makeup of the independent entity and what its responsibilities are. And that the most important thing to do for this working group is to figure out what are the right questions to be asking, and that we don't necessarily need to answer those questions within the working group, but we need to be asking these questions. So as we have this expansion of the conversation from the introduction of what was the intent behind the entity from the Citizens Bill, primer on telematics, at some point we need to be writing down or recording our continuous thought of all these open questions that we have. And some questions might lead to more questions. So I think in the subsequent meetings after that, I would find it worthwhile to like have us start digging into, are we asking the right questions, or what else, what other unknowns do we need to go figure out?
So it sounds like we're sort of on board with having maybe the next meeting would be folks from sort of the independent repair, right to repair side of things. Well, no, let me start over. It seems like for our second meeting, it would be helpful to have a presentation from the Right to Repair Coalition folks on sort of what their thinking was behind the provision creating the independent entity. And then also having a presentation from both sort of the independent repair side of things and also from the automobile manufacturer side of things on like a primer on telematics and vehicle data and all that stuff. And then I think it sounds like we're also thinking that it would make sense for this third meeting to be even like more of like a drill down technical meeting where maybe we get folks who have even more technical knowledge, although maybe not more than Brian, but more than other folks, to give a presentation on sort of a more drilled down detailed area. Is that kind of where we are? Okay. So I guess what I'm thinking is if members want to start thinking about who it makes sense to invite, and then maybe at the second meeting, people could come prepared to propose who we want to invite to the third meeting. And then if we have an agreement that those are the right people, then we could extend the invitation for them to come to the third meeting. Yeah.
I think that sounds great. And I'm glad Brian raised the, as sort of subsequent meetings, are we heading in the right direction with questions about as we get into the independent entity? But I just wanted to stress that I think I really appreciate this approach that you've taken. I think it's the right direction to have the technical conversation first so that we know when we're talking about the independent entity, what it truly is that they're going to be wrestling with. And so I think we're definitely approaching this in the right order. So thank you for setting that up.
Any other comments, thoughts, concerns, questions? Okay. So that really might sort of do it for kind of the logistics and housekeeping part of this. Unless there are other things that people want to talk about, my thought would be to sort of now go to the remote meeting policy, and then after that, talk about the schedule for our next two meetings. But before I go there, are there any other topics or issues that people think we should address before we adjourn?
If possible, I would find it beneficial that we're all here today to get like at least a precursor on the introduction behind the intent for the independent entity, so that we're as prepared as we can be for the future working groups, and that we benefit from all being here together in person, at least for this initial meeting.
I think that would be helpful. Although I know that, so Tommy Hickey couldn't be here today. He got tied up in the stuff going on around the bridge this morning, getting out of Massachusetts. And so I don't know if you'd be prepared to give a little bit of discussion about this.
Sure, I can be brief. The idea around the independent entity as it was placed into the initiated legislation, the ballot question. I think the view was the independent entity would be a place where both sides of this issue, manufacturers and dealers, and then the independent auto repair shops and the aftermarket parts industry could sit and iron out questions around how best to apply, the best technology to implement this law. That would be the first component of the independent entity. The second component of the independent entity would be to have an enforcement group, somebody or an entity that would be able to make sure that there is compliance with the law as well too. And I think just very briefly, that was in my again, and we'll present on this next week, and we'll have folks that actually were very much a part of the drafting of the language. They can go into greater detail, but that was in essence the intent around the independent entity as it was placed in the ballot question.
If I heard you correctly, it's a place where these different parties that are part of this ecosystem can iron out questions around the technology to be used for automotive repair, especially in a wireless context. That was the main, that was number one. And number two was the enforcement group for compliance. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think it sounds like when we have some other folks with us at the next meeting, we can probably flesh out a bit more sort of what the thinking is for the independent entity. I think Tommy Hickey probably has a lot of stuff that he can say about that is my guess. Okay. Brian, was there anything else you wanted to ask about that or?
I think if I start asking questions, we might go into many questions. So is it possible that we wrap up the remote meeting policy portion first and then we can do more questions after?
That's, yeah, if everyone's okay with that, that I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Just on the independent entity, just to follow up. So as everyone's aware, there was a similar ballot question that was passed in Massachusetts. And I believe that there was an independent entity component to that as well. That never kind of took off because both sides weren't able to come to the table. And so this is a proposal that is based on a past experience, hoping to create the best result for the state of Maine and for consumers in the state of Maine. And that's the intent really around the independent entity.
Yeah, so why don't we go to the remote meeting policy and then, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So Chris alluded to this earlier, and I just think this would be a foundational issue that would be really interesting to know if everybody's on the same page that we are, which is that we interpreted the initiative as not having the independent entity house the data, but to prescribe standards for how the data is accessed. And I was just wondering if everybody's on the same page with that. That's
That is
very
correct. Our intent was
fundamental.
never to have the independent entity house the actual data.
Go ahead.
I would say the law is unclear. And there's a question as to whether or not the independent entity, I mean, we simply don't know what role it's going to play in managing the data. So is it housed there? Does it run through there? I mean, what is what are the complexities and intersections between those two things? So I think there's an open question there for us. But it's good to hear that's the intent.
And I would say that in past testimony in front of the legislature, we were very clear in that in our intent to make sure that data was not housed in that independent entity. So this isn't the first time that that's been declared.
Yeah, I agree with the comment that the law is unclear. I could interpret it in multiple ways. And so regardless of intent, like as written, it could be interpreted as all the data traffic and the actual individual request to access data and the granting of the request, the rejection of the request is all administered, the word from the bill, by the independent entity. So that's a very different interpretation than the one where it is primarily an agency that is a rulemaking agency that identifies standards and enforces compliance. And so there's a very large gap in the current wording because the wording is unclear.
And we would disagree with that. And what we can do is in that presentation that we'll provide to the working group at the next meeting, we'll make sure we address those questions.
So I may have been premature after all in flagging this, but I do think that that's going to be a very foundational issue for this group to tackle. And I think it can, if there's consensus on what it should be, even if people think that the law is unclear, I mean, that's certainly something that this group can make recommendations about.
I think that it's going to be, as I'm grappling with these issues, how the entity starts with, what type of role it has in terms of controlling the data is going to inform what kind of enforcement is necessary. Because if you're holding the data and you're the one who pushes the button to say yes or no, you get it, that's a very different enforcement landscape than it is if you're just someone who sets the rules and now you come before me like a court and argue about whether or not somebody else gave you access. So that, yeah, that's what I'm grappling with too.
And I don't know if this was the intent, but I mean, my initial sort of interpretation of the provisions about the independent entity is that it was sort of like create standards that would standardize how the information can be obtained. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I have the sense that maybe different manufacturers have different protocols and different ways of authorizing access. And so maybe part of the independent entity's job was to kind of like standardize the access. So it sort of doesn't require someone to, go to, a different manufacturer each time they're working on a different car. But again, I don't know if that was the intent or not, but I think like there are at least 3 different possibilities and maybe more, but like one is the data is housed with the entity. Number 2, the data sort of like somehow flows through the entity and the entity has the ability to like turn on or off the data. Or maybe the third one is the independent entity is just creating like standardized methods by which the information gets accessed. And so I don't know if any of those things are what the intent was, but I think those are all things that we can be thinking about.
The intent would be direct access from the manufacturer to the actual owner of the vehicle without a pass-through, without housing the data. That was the intent of the initiated legislation.
Could I just jump in here? I want to just quote the language of the legislation that says that the independent entity is to create a platform that must be capable of securely communicating all mechanical data emanating directly from the motor vehicle via direct connection to the platform, and that must be a standardized platform as well. So I would take issue with the representation that there isn't going to be any standardization amongst those because it's in the law itself.
But I think to my earlier point, I think this group can, to some degree, make policy recommendations. And I think if this group believes that it should be what the coalition thought it was, then I think, if there's consensus there certainly is a path forward.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think, citizen initiated bills, aren't always perfectly drafted because they don't have the benefit of folks like OPLA and sort of the vetting process that we normally have for pieces of legislation. And so I find this section about the independent entity confusing, and I agree it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But I fully agree with what Christina said, which is, if we can reach consensus on what the independent entity should be doing, then I think, we can recommend to the legislature that the language be adjusted to make sure that the intent that we've all agreed upon, or at least that we think is there, gets put into law. So So I'm just saying, I guess that maybe we shouldn't get tied up into discussions about like what the law, how the law could be interpreted or not to be interpreted, because I think at this point, it's sort of up to us to decide really what the best interpretation is. And then make sure that that is the interpretation that gets followed. All right, so why don't we turn and Brian, if we want to talk some more at the end of the meeting about these issues, we can ask. I'll give you a chance to ask more questions. So for the remote meeting policy, Maine's Freedom of Access Act basically has a sort of, the default is that all meetings are in person. All meetings of public bodies, and we are a public body, are done in person. One of the exceptions is that a public body can meet remotely if it has a written policy that's been adopted after notice and public comment, and has certain sort of requirements in it. If the body adopts that policy, then it can have subsequent meetings remotely. Now, a lot of entities in state government will have remote policies that sort of make it sort of still make the presumption that meetings are going to be in person. But if there's really some like unforeseen circumstance, or it's going to be like really difficult for a particular person to get to the meeting, they're 6 hours away, or there's some issue where it's just really hard for them to get to the physical location. Like there are a lot of entities have policies which will say in those circumstances the member can attend remotely, but it doesn't have to be that strict. And so what we were thinking is for our policy is that we would have a very liberal policy, which I think essentially is going to be, and I think it says right in the draft, that if any member determines that their physical presence is not practicable or otherwise inconvenient, and so it's really just inconvenience to the member is sufficient reason for the member to attend remotely. And so I think what that means is that, in most cases, like unless you live in the state office building, it's probably going to be inconvenient for you to come here for a meeting. So this is just another way of saying, like, the way we've structured the policy, really the default is that all of our meetings are going to be by Zoom. Now, there might be some folks here, I don't know, who don't like that idea, that they think we all should get together in person whenever possible. And so we can talk about that, although I think we should probably have sort of the public hearing first. And then we can open up for discussion about the policy. But I just wanted to let you know sort of what our thinking was, is that we would have a policy that's very liberal and will essentially allow us to have our meetings remotely, in most cases. So that's how we drafted it. What I thought we should do is we should open up sort of the public hearing portion of the meeting, hear any public comments, and then after that, we can all have a discussion about whether we think this policy makes sense or not, and if people have questions about it. Is that agreeable to everyone? Okay. So let me open sort of the public hearing portion of this meeting. And this is a public hearing just to hear from folks on who want to comment just on the proposed policy for remote meetings. So this isn't for comments generally on the work of the group or on the law. It's just about adoption of a remote meeting policy. And so let me just ask if there's anyone who wants to come forward and offer comments about that.
Hi, I'm Amanda Collmore. I'm a representative for House District 68, which is Pittsfield, Clinton, Burnham, and Troy. I'm also the ranking member on the Innovation Development, Economic Advancement, and Business Committee, also known as IDEA-B. Having lived through both the remote world of COVID policymaking and the in-person world, followed by that of policymaking, I do understand and appreciate the importance of having a virtual presence, and I think that's very important. We have somebody traveling thousands of miles to be here to provide his cybersecurity expertise to this group, and it's important that he has a better option than to come to Maine every 2 weeks. However, that being said, we live in a very rural state where most of us travel 1.5 to 2 hours to get to and from work. And it shouldn't just be about if it's inconvenient. Bangor is not that far. I came down here from Orono this morning because I work at the University of Maine. And I feel that unless there is a true thousands of miles commute that requires you to take a plane to get here, that everybody should be here because the best policy is made when you are in the room talking and seeing each other in the face. But it also allows you to see everybody that's sitting here so that you know how many people this is important to. Because when you're doing it on Zoom, you don't get to see the faces of the audience. I know that as a legislator. And it's very frustrating to not know how many people are actually watching until after the fact. So I would advocate that you do not do the very liberal version and would ask that there be exceptions made for people traveling thousands of miles, or maybe there's a conference that somebody has to go to that's thousands of miles away. Those would be the exceptions to the rule of having people here in person. Thank you very much.
Let me just ask if anyone has questions for
Oh,
you.
yeah.
Any questions for Representative? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Representative Tiffany Roberts, House District 149, and I am House Chair of the Innovation Development, Economic Advancement and Business Committee. And much to many people's surprise, my lead and I concur on most things. And I'm going to echo what Representative Collmore says. Under the remote in-person kind of, this is now my 6th year in the legislature, but so I've seen it on each side. But what I will also say is that the committee, spent over a year and a half on this. It's a complicated topic. A lot can get lost when you're online, and everyone here at the table was put on here, and these seats are put on here because it would drastically affect your businesses, your lives, everything. So for, I think, the people of Maine who voted for this and everyone to see that everyone's fully invested in the conversation, in the meetings, and in the outcome. Like Representative Collmore said, I understand, Brian, it's a bit of a flight. My husband doesn't do that in 1 week. So I think that, again, I drove 2 hours to get here and I'm just over the Mass border. So that would be my preference. And if back in November to receive this report, would feel much better about the recommendation coming to us, knowing people are in a room. It's a different conversation when you can look someone in the eye, I think.
Any questions?
I have a question.
Hi. I'm struggling between the knowledge that it is better to see people face to face and the also reality that we have a few people from out of state who are not being paid to be here. It is important to all of us. I think we wouldn't have accepted a position here if we didn't feel like we wanted to uphold. But I'm struggling between having people participate, even if it's not thousands and thousands of miles, but a few hundred miles, and still allowing them to participate versus them not being able to participate because getting here is a 2-hour drive and then going back for a 1-hour committee meeting. So I don't know that this is my turn to say, how do I turn this into a question? But
Don't you think?
But just like, how are you weighing that in terms of if we come back to your committee and some people really didn't show up because it was a 2-hour drive each way and they weren't being paid to be, I'm just,
Right.
yeah, how that cuts.
No, I do. And I do. I understand the question and I understand the concern. I think that, is there a happy medium? Is there, okay, this is the commute for me. So it's not feasible to do every 2 weeks. But I absolutely can do every other. I think there just needs to be an agreement that being in the room is the preferred method, but also you're not, included if you're not, it's, we absolutely understand. Like Representative Collmore said, we travel, a lot of us travel a long ways for not a lot of money. It's not nothing, but it's a lot. But I guess I think that there is a happy medium, but I do think that like adopting a primarily remote wouldn't be my preference, especially if I was on the receiving committee of the report for something this complicated.
Here's what I'm grappling with. Where do you draw the line? So if we have an expert that lives in Lebanon, New Hampshire, or we have an expert that lives in Boston, or we have an expert that lives in Hartford, Connecticut, or we have an expert that lives in Providence, Rhode Island, or we have an expert that lives in New York City, if it's not feasible for them to be there that day, yet they can deliver very valuable expertise, how are we going to make that determination, I guess? Is it,
Okay,
is it
so
the,
I guess clarification, Mr. Gallagher, I was speaking about the committee, the working group itself. Are you talking about people coming in to present?
I was, because I don't think it was
Okay.
clear that it wasn't just
Okay,
the committee.
so to be clear, I was talking about the working group itself, the members of the group. Is that help? Okay,
Yes, I don't think it was clear that we were just talking about the committee membership.
perfect.
Thank you.
And do you, I mean, even for members, do you have a recommendation of what would be the cutoff point? I mean, obviously, hundreds of miles and you have to fly in.
Yeah, that's,
but
I mean, I can tell you, I'll drive the 2.5, 5 miles, 5 hours every meeting to be here, most likely.
So 2.5 hours.
I
one
mean,
way?
that's,
Yeah.
that, I'm just telling you, like, as a gauge for me, it's a little over 2 for me. I plan on making the drive if whenever possible.
Okay, thanks.
One of I've seen a lot of different remote meeting policies, and one of the challenges is that it's hard to sort of give objective criteria in the policies. Like it's hard to say a drive of more than 2 hours is impracticable, or a drive from out of state is impractical, because it might be someone driving from out of state actually has a much shorter drive than someone from in-state. So, so a lot of policies will just refer to it being impracticable, whatever that means. We've sort of gone one step beyond impractical and said impractical or inconvenient. But I'm wondering how you would feel if we rolled back to just impracticable, but still left it to the members to decide for themselves what they would consider to be impracticable.
I think that is reasonable, because I think, as Ms. Sway had said, inconvenient is coming up and not getting paid to offer your expertise. So I think impractical, standalone. I mean, I absolutely thank everyone here for giving their time. This is invaluable to our state to get this input. So yeah, I mean, it's probably not convenient for everyone to be here.
But you would be comfortable if impracticable was the standard?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
With just having, Representative Collmore and I kind of feeling stated.
Yep.
As
Representative Collmore, how would you feel about if that were the standard? Impracticable at the discretion of the member.
I think that would be better than how it was currently written, and my intent was only for the committee members. We operate remotely for our content experts frequently. I still, if they're in the area, they should be here because that does make it easier on the committee. However, we understand that, especially in this particular area of expertise, Maine is not a car manufacturing state. And so we have to keep that part in mind for the experts. But I mean, I'm not getting paid to be here either. So when you're talking about that, I had to take a leave of absence from work today to be here because this is that important. So not getting paid to be here is, in my opinion, not impracticable for being here. That's not a reason, in my opinion, because I'm not getting paid to be here either. I'm not in session. I don't get mileage. I am just here because this is an important topic to all Mainers.
Any other questions for either?
We should have just come up together.
All right, I guess, I'm sorry, are there other members or other members of the public who want to comment?
I'll be really brief and first, Bruce Garrity on behalf of the Maine Automobile Dealers Association. I'm sorry for not identifying myself for the record. I would have two suggestions. First, that unless something's really inconvenient, I think people should be here. Having lived through as a lobbyist the remote times we had with COVID, it's very difficult to give people an effective presentation for your information when you're doing it remotely. You can't see people's faces. You can't do what I'm doing and sort of pan the room so that everybody appreciates the points I'm making and that I'm paying attention to them, not just you, for example. Although I always love just paying attention to you. That would be one point. The second point is, unless it's really inconvenient, I would respectfully suggest that experts be here. especially experts from the Independent Repair Association and the manufacturers. I'm presuming that those people will be paid. I know it's an extremely important issue to the repair folks and to manufacturers, and for that matter, to dealers. I'm sure it's important to the secondary parts associations like the O'Reillys of the world and their manufacturers. I think I would respectfully suggest they be here. And meetings, people in meetings take breaks. It just, it's a long day. And there might be an interest in some of you discussing a point if you feel you're on the same side of an issue. You can't really do that during a break if you're not there. And then when you come, you can't really set up an independent meeting for each Zoom person and what have you. And the last point I would make, I think it would be a good idea that you have from the state a technical advisor, let's call it, who is a mechanic, who is a service provider. You have people who are really expert, who take care of state police cars, who take care of DOT cars, who take care of various other kinds of vehicles. And I would suggest it be a very senior person, but I'm sure that the Secretary of State's office can identify someone who would be in Augusta, who would be available to be here, not as a member, but as someone who, if there's a question, you have a single technical advisor beyond when there are meetings, when you're hearing from other people, having someone like that here with sort of an independent voice could be of great assistance to the committee, I think, or the study group. And thanks for letting me make these comments.
Questions?
I'm Bill Bell. I'm here on behalf of the Maine Auto Recyclers Association, which has an interest in this subject. I just want to kind of pass on the successful experience of several other groups like this that I've been a member or participant in with the Secretary of State's office. One had to do with catalytic converters, which was of national interest. And those meetings, which were run through the Department of Motor Vehicles with the Secretary of State's help, had some meetings they had one, I think, which had no internet connection, like this one. And then they had some where people could be online after the initial discussions had taken place. And that worked well. A law was passed and unanimously by the legislature afterwards. Right now, there is a group which, like this, is putting Maine in the forefront of automotive policy, having to do with online advertising. And no state has dealt with this yet. The Maine Secretary of State has taken a very active interest in having Maine be a model state. And actually, one of the major online car sales firms, Carvana, is very active. And the Carvana representative was present at the initial meeting. Subsequently, because they're located in Phoenix, they participated remotely. And it's worked fine. Because of their role, everybody is attentive to Carvana. Obviously, they know that they would be better understood if they were at the meeting itself. But I think there has to be considerable allowance for just totally impractical for someone from Phoenix or California, et cetera, to not be able to participate remotely. Thank you.
Any questions? All right, thank you very much. Any other comments from the public on the draft proposed remote meeting policy? Okay. All right, so I guess I'll open it up for discussion. Just to frame the discussion a little bit, I think we have at least a couple options. We have the policy as drafted. We have a suggestion or an alternative idea, maybe not a suggestion, but an alternative idea is to strike the part or otherwise inconvenient and just say that physical presence is required unless it wouldn't be practicable. And I'm sure we could also have other variations on that as well. So let me just throw it open to the members and sort of see what folks think about what our policy should look like.
I would agree with the concerns that have been raised about sort of the nature of remote versus in-person policymaking, having also experienced it during COVID, and now that we're back in person. And I think the sort of option that you just mentioned about changing to the requirement that it be impracticable but not necessarily inconvenient would, it's for me, I think, be a reasonable compromise. And I think that would get most people here most of the time. And then if they can't be here, that's still great that they can participate virtually. So that would be my preference.
I would say I endorse or support the initial draft. I think that many speakers here today have said that this issue is critical to consumers in Maine. And again, my concern is how do you determine, impractical versus inconvenient? And are we going to leave people out of the process who might have incredible insight and value to the working group? So that's my feeling.
I mean, just a couple thoughts about that. First, I think no matter what our policy is about the members' requirement to be here in person, we are always free to allow consultants and experts and third parties to appear remotely. So although I've certainly heard the comment that it might be better to try to get those experts to be here in person. But whatever we do with our policy for our attendance doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to drag experts here if it's going to be difficult for them.
And I guess I should have been more clear. It also catches, if we are to amend that section of the draft remote meeting policy, it does catch members. And if it becomes a situation where a member can't get here physically, yet has some valuable insight for that particular subject, we've laid out subjects today that we want to address at future meetings. If it makes it difficult for a member to be here, they won't be able to include that insight.
That's a fair point. My thought is, and I'm not sure if this would be correct or not, but my thought is that if you can't get to the meet, like if your position is such that you really just can't get to the meeting, and so your choices are, not going to the meeting, like that seems to be impractical at that point. So like if someone's in San Francisco, that, and they say, look, like I can't make it to the meeting because I'm in San Francisco, like at that point, it's impractical. So I guess maybe you can articulate this better than I can, because I think you probably were ready to say the same thing.
I was going to say the same thing. And I would also add that we have at least one member who is traveling far enough that I think we're always going to have, no matter how much in-person participation we have, we're always going to have also remote participation. So we're always going to have that technology available to members of the public and members of the group who can't come because it's impracticable to do so. So I don't think anybody would be closed off. It's just a matter of, do you cross the line to impracticable? And I think that the policy does and would remain. I haven't heard anybody say that it shouldn't remain the decision of the member whether or not it's practicable for them to come. Does that help?
It does.
Any other comments? Yeah, Megan?
I think from an accessibility standpoint, I'm okay striking or inconvenient, but would want to keep is not practicable because I want as many people as possible to participate. And would never want a situation where you could be on Zoom, but the rules said you couldn't call in but by Zoom because of wording that we had. So I would be okay leaving at if your physical presence is not practicable as determined by each work group member. Otherwise that we're here in person.
I would agree with that. I think while I am sensitive to the in-person nature having some superior qualities, I'm also concerned with the aggressiveness of our schedule, and we have a lot to do in a very short period of time. And the more we make it harder for folks to get to these meetings, then the more difficult it's going to be to do that.
Yeah, I had the same thought. This is a really aggressive meeting schedule. There's not many committees or groups in government that are meeting every 2 weeks like we are. I'm sure there are others out there, but this I think is a little bit unusual. Yeah.
But I also think to your earlier point, Chris, that if a member is faced with, well, I'm not going to be able to come if I have to go, I'm not going to be able to participate if I have to go physically, I think that in almost every instance would meet the standard of impracticable and they would be able to participate remotely. I also wonder if we should, and I just throw this out there, have some language that says in-person participation is preferred?
Yeah.
That was actually going to be my original suggestion. I think they sort of 6 and 1/2 dozen of the other, frankly, but if you include both of them, then it's a belt and suspenders approach. It's just sort of saying, look, we're saying if you can be here, be here. If you can't, be here on Zoom.
So I'm looking, I don't know if everyone has the policy in front of them. I'm looking at the third paragraph. And so what if we said, in-person participation by individual working group members is preferred, period. Individual working group members may attend a meeting of the working group by a remote method when a member determines that their physical presence is not practicable, period. Are people okay with that? Okay, and never having chaired something like this, I don't know if we need to have a motion or something, but
Sorry,
why don't we play it
I
safe?
have
Can
one
someone make a
question.
motion?
I just have a question. Given the compressed meeting schedule, if say I could not make, and the time of year that we're doing this, if I could not make this meeting, does this allow for me to send someone in my stead for my organization?
That's a really good question. And so our thought is that yes, that if
Okay.
you can't attend in person, in fact, we have two proxies here today.
Okay.
We think the proxy should be coming from like the same organization, obviously. But if there's someone else at the ACLU that you want to send in there, I mean, unless anyone has objections to that, I think sending a proxy is an acceptable alternative.
Thank you. I just want
Yeah.
clarification.
And to be clear, I mean, I think the AG's appointments were of organizations more than the specific individual within an organization.
I'm just clarifying because of other legislative subcommittees where we have not been allowed to substitute people. So that's why I'm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's up to this group. If this group is okay with a proxy attending, and I haven't seen anyone expressing opposition, then I think we can allow that.
Should the proxy be in the writing?
I'm sorry?
Should allowing the proxy be in the writing of?
Probably wouldn't hurt. Yeah.
But would that be in the remote meeting policy or would that be something else?
Yeah, it really doesn't fit within the remote meeting policy, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure that we need to put that in writing. I think we're all on board with it, and I don't see any objections. So
As long as the working group doesn't become a revolving door of attendees. It's good. It sounds like we have a lot to do and it's a complicated subject. And so if different people are speaking to it each meeting, then it'd be less efficient.
that's a fair point, and I think this would always be subject to revision if we see it becoming a revolving door. Then I think maybe at that point we change our policy and say that it has to be the specific person each time. But my expectation is that sort of the designated people are going to be attending each meeting. It's just going to be in a really exceptional circumstance where something happens and they can't make it, and so they send a proxy. But if it does become a revolving door, then I think we're going to have to revisit that.
Would the working group consider having in detail language that allowed for one designated proxy? So it's always, it's either the working group member or one designated proxy.
I mean, my thought, and again, it's up to the group to decide what they want to do, but like, I don't want to make this overly complicated if we don't have to. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but if it does become a problem, then maybe we either say no proxies or we say you can have one proxy and that's it. I'm just thinking to try to keep this as like streamlined as possible for now. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. Does anyone want to make a motion?
To accept the remote meeting policy?
Yeah, as revised.
amended, yes.
Yeah.
Motion to accept the remote meeting policy as revised to indicate that members should be here unless it is impracticable. Maybe you had something else there.
Yeah, so let me just reread it, and
Okay.
because I think this is what your motion is for, right? So individual working group members, in-person participation of individual working group members is preferred. Individual working group members may attend a meeting of the working group by a remote method when a member determines that their physical presence is not practicable. And
Yes.
so is your motion to adopt that as
Yes,
revised? Okay,
correct.
and is there a second for that motion? All
Second.
right. And just by a show of hands, I think, is there all in favor of that? Okay, looks unanimous of those present.
I was gonna say, I don't think we get two.
No, we don't
votes.
get 2 votes. I don't think. So what we'll do is we'll make that revision to the policy and we will post it and circulate it. We'll circulate it to everyone by email and to the interested parties list, and then we will post on the website as well. Hopefully we can get that out no later than tomorrow, I think. And again, Brian, I'll give you a chance to ask any questions if you have, but one more thing I think we should just do. I don't know if we're in a position to actually schedule our meetings right now for the next 2 meetings, but I at least wanted to throw out some dates, and then maybe people can, when they go back to their offices, maybe they could check their calendars, and then hopefully maybe let us know by like end of day tomorrow if these days are going to work. Our thought was to have our second meeting on either September 11th, 12th, or 13th. And then to have our third meeting either September 26 or 27. We were thinking like maybe the meetings would be at either time is flexible. I mean, I think the afternoon meetings, it seems like people had a preference for afternoon meetings, but it doesn't have to be that way. But I'm wondering if people could just go back to their office and if they have any conflicts or a strong preference for one of those different days in those 2 blocks, if they could let us know by end of day tomorrow. And I'll send out an email to the folks who aren't here and let them know as well. But does that seem reasonable to folks to let us know by end of day tomorrow? Okay. And so again, that was September 11th, 12th, or 13th for the second meeting, and September 26th or 27th for the third meeting. All right, that is all I had. Brian, are there any other questions that you had that you wanted to ask at this point, or do you want to wait until next meeting, or?
Maybe these are open-ended questions for all of us to think about when we consider what is the role of the independent entity in, and what types of problems is it trying to solve in the future. So as an example, who or what type of individuals are authorized to obtain access to remote data from a vehicle? Can those, it's clear as written that those individuals include independent repairers, independent repair facilities. Does that mean independent repair facilities in other states? Can independent repair facility in Arizona obtain remote access to a vehicle in Maine? The wording uses the word facility, like must they have a brick and mortar facility, or can they just be an individual? Can it be your neighbor down the street, or must it be independent repair facility? What about other countries? If it's an independent repair in Bulgaria or any country, is it acceptable that they can obtain remote access to the vehicle? And so those are the types of questions I think are important for the independent entity to figure out, and that the entity is structured around making good decisions in these areas. Another open question is, when or under what conditions is a request for access invalid? For example, if it's the individual making the request is kind it's clear that it's coming from a known hostile country. Is that, must that be approved, or does it get rejected? Which is really just a question of, are there conditions under which a request can be rejected? Or must every request for access, as long as the owner authorizes it, it gets fulfilled? And earlier, someone brought up the question of funding, and I think that is an important question to determine whether there's a big scope interpretation of the independent entity as developing a software platform and having staff, and that the data traffic is routing through the software platform. Clearly, that would need some amount of funding, but even the smaller scope view of the independent entity is identifying and creating standards and conducting compliance both on the vehicle manufacturers as well as on the receiving individuals, that they are adhering to the standards. I imagine that takes some amount of funding. So I think the funding questions are important to dig into. And the enforcement authority, as stated, seems to focus primarily on monitoring of manufacturer compliance, but I think it also should be considered what type of monitoring needs to exist on the recipients of the data. Are they, because this telematics data by definition contains sensitive private information about the individual using the vehicle, the speed that they're driving, what time they left their house, where they're going, when did they arrive at work, how often they're using their car, what stations they're listening to, lots of different information. So it's private information. And when it is received by an individual, they need to be good stewards of this private data. So it's important that the independent entity consider how to think about monitoring, not just of the mechanism at which the information is made available, but what is done with the information once it has been received. And if there needs to be ongoing monitoring, or at least policies or standards on how to be good stewards of the public's data. So I don't, like I mentioned earlier, I actually don't think that this working group is going to answer any of these questions, but these are the types of questions that we need to recognize, because then they clearly define the scope and the role and the nature of the independent entity.
Yeah, no, I think those are all excellent questions.
There we go. I just want to be clear, in the initiated legislation, the only required access, or the only required information, I should say, is diagnostic and repair information.
Diagnostic and repair information has a very broad interpretation in various regulations, both in the United States at different state levels, as well as internationally, which is a pretty big picture view of the real-time data from a vehicle. Many manufacturers make available to their owners a mobile app application, and in this mobile app, they can see information like speed, what gear the vehicle is in, how many occupants are in the vehicle. Even although you might not think of the number of occupants as in the vehicle as being within the worldview of repair and maintenance information, it is, because if you are a technician working on a vehicle and the seat sensor is not working well, the seat sensor is somebody present, not present. That is just real-time information used for repair and maintenance. So although the scope as written, yes, it says like used for diagnostics and repair. Well, diagnostics and repair, any portion of a vehicle can break. so, and by break, I mean malfunction or fail, then almost any signal in the vehicle could be considered as being used for diagnosing, is it functioning or is it not functioning?
Thank you. You cited where you're traveling, the speed you're traveling. I don't think, again, I'm not an expert. I don't know that that would get caught in either repair or diagnostic information.
Let's talk about the speed. As this is written, and I actually think it's one of the an accidental gap in the wording. In the required equipment section, it describes making motor vehicle data available remotely. And it also describes that it's required to make the ability to send commands to the vehicle available remotely if those commands are used for purposes of maintenance, diagnostics, and repair. So it is essentially saying any type of information or repair commands that you might use when you're physically present at a vehicle, working on a vehicle. Maybe you're working on the transmission system, and the transmission system is the device that measures the speed of the vehicle. You, as a technician physically at a car, are therefore plugged in looking at the speed of the car. And so as this is written, it's saying, well, that same signal needs to be available remotely. So therefore, the speed of the vehicle is within the scope of maintenance, diagnostics, and repair, and would be available remotely.
So just for what it's worth, I mean, this debate might be similar to the debate we had before about whether the independent entity is going to be sort of a pass-through or a holder or a facilitator. It might be that the statute as written isn't perfectly clear on some of this information and whether or not it should be available. But if we reach a consensus on what should or shouldn't be available, that might be another recommendation that we make to the legislature to make clear that there is certain information which, although it technically might fall within the definition, maybe it should be excluded because it's not really the kind of data that we think is appropriate for folks to have. So that's just my observation. But I think all the questions that you're asking are ones that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because as written, it's saying all this data needs to be available in the vehicle and remote from the vehicle, and all the commands that you might apply when you're physically at a vehicle, you would also need to be able to apply remotely, which just don't make sense from a cybersecurity perspective either. I've described the example of if you're physically at a vehicle working on a car and it's on a lift and you're working on the braking system, it might make sense to send a command that disengages the parking brake so that you can work on the brake system. If you were remote from that vehicle, it would not make sense to be able to send a command that disengages the parking brake on the vehicle. And so vehicle manufacturers today limit our own capability, that it's just not possible to send the command that says disengage the parking brake. But for me to comply with this law, I would now need to create new commands that I don't believe should exist that would allow someone remotely to disengage the parking brake, and that car might be on a hill and it rolls down on off of the hill. And so those are the types of challenges that that this independent entity is faced with.
Yeah, okay. All right, any other comments or questions or observations before we adjourn?
I just want to make sure that everyone in the audience is aware, heard Chris's comment that we've got a webpage that will be providing updated information, and it includes a subscribe here to be on the interested person's notification list. So if anybody in the audience hasn't subscribed and wants to make sure that they get notified, I just want to remind people that that's there.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know. Next time we should do some.
Yeah. But yeah,
Just a quick question.
yes.
Or perhaps a committee to deal with before you adjourn. Do you want to set a policy in terms of people who are following the meeting remotely and their ability to speak to the committee at the end of the session or at some point. In other words, legislative committees, you have to register in advance and put some control. But you might want to consider.
Yeah, so my thought is for this first meeting, I don't think we're going to address that because I think we have our work cut out for us for the next two meetings. It might be that at our next meeting we decide that we want to hear from the public at our third meeting. But I think that's something that we should probably address after. But it's a great point. I suspect that members are going to want to have at least one or more meetings where we hear from the public. Probably not every meeting. But certainly at least one, if not more meetings where we hear from the public. So I think that's an excellent idea, just not something that I think we're going to address at this meeting. No, I appreciate the observation. It's a good one. All right, any other business for today before we adjourn? All right, seeing none, thank you so much everyone for coming, and we will see you in a couple weeks.
Do you think we'll be in this meeting room again?
I don't know.